Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Can everybody hear me? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe not, maybe not. Okay. All right. Thank you, Jason. So I'll be teaching today. Next week we'll have a guest speaker. Craig Jordan will be in here. But we're going to keep going on the lessons he's set up from the life of David. And today we're going to talk about taking advice and good advice and what's good advice, what's not good advice. And I hope to get a lot of input from you all so we can sort it out a little better about advice and what to listen to and what not to listen to. But you know, we live in a day and age when people are willing to give advice. I don't know if you've noticed that yet or not. In fact, they're not only willing to give advice, they want to, and they will interrupt you to give you that advice. And a lot of times, even if it's bad advice, they'll say it to you, and they'll just turn up the volume and say it louder and louder to make sure that you hear it. Well, I can't talk about that. My mother-in-law doesn't do that. So. But as God's people, we need to be able to differentiate between what's good advice and what's not. And that's what we're going to talk about today. That's what we're going to look at. And we're going to start from the life of David. It's a longer reading today, 1 Samuel chapter 15. You have to excuse me if there's some typo or something up here, just overlook it. I don't do slides very often, and I don't even know if I read over them again after I typed it the first time. So there probably is. But we're going to look at 1 Samuel chapter 15, and we're going to look at a longer section. This is a story about David and Nabal and Abigail. And in this story, we're going to see about David receives some advice. And he does recognize that it's good advice, and it changes his actions and what he does. So if you have your Bible, turn over there. 1 Samuel chapter 15. 1 Samuel chapter 15. And we're going to skip through it. We're going to look at the first three verses, and then 10 through 14, and then 18 through 33. Then David rose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. And there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. Chapter 15, I believe. Oh, I even messed that up. Hang on. Thank you. Thank you. Let me rephrase it. Maybe I did, maybe someone else did who handed me this. Let's see. Find it quickly. $25, excuse me. I missed it by a digit. 1 Samuel 25. Starting the second part of verse 1. Then David rose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. There was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000... Yeah. Yeah, the second part of verse 1. Second part. Yeah, second half of 21. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife was Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. I don't know if being a Calebite equated with being harsh and badly behaved, but it was interesting that he put that in there. Verse 10, and Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come come from, I do not know where. So David's young men turned away and came back and told him all this. And David said to his men, every man strap on his sword. And every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword, and about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master, and he railed at them. Let's skip down to verse 18. Then Abigail made haste, took 200 loaves and 2 skins of wine, and 5 sheep already prepared, and 5 seahs of parched grain, and 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on donkeys. And she said to her young men, go on before me. Behold, I come after you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. Now as she rode on the donkey and came down under cover of the mountain, behold, David and his men came down toward her, and she met them. Now David had said, surely in vain have I guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him, and he returned to me evil for good. God, do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. When Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, on me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears, and hear the word of your servant. Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. Now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives, as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt, and from saving with your own hand. Now then, let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. If men rise up to pursue you and seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living in the care of the Lord your God. And the lives of your enemies he shall sing out as from the hollow of a sling. And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that has been spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation himself. And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant. And David said to Abigail, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. Now, I apologize, there's a long section, but there's a lot that goes on, and to get the whole story, we needed to see the front end and the back end on this. As we've read this, does someone have initial thoughts about the story and about David in this section? Because all of these lessons that we've been going over come out of David's life, and David we can learn from. And I think when we look at a lot of the stories, this one in particular, we see that David, he may be different than I imagined him. But what are someone's initial thoughts as we go through here? Go ahead, Chris.
Your translation, when you're reading, when it was David talking about his actions and stuff, it kept using the word salvation, whereas my translation says avenging myself.
Very good.
Not to say which one is wrong or whatever, but I thought like a more descriptive version of what David's actions are avenging himself.
Very good, yeah.
Salvation, like we think, like God is saving us.
Mm-hmm.
Avenging, like, oh, my pride is on the line, now I have to defend myself,
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing.
No, thank you for bringing that up.
It's
Because
not really justice in the sense of like what we think is justice. It's justice like one man's done wrong to me, now I'm going to get that.
Right. And it's very true, because, you read this, and overall you have a different idea of David. But here, he's just, Yeah, he is. He is. He's going to as it says there, avenge or to punish someone because they didn't cooperate with him. And from his point of view, he says that, this man's things are all out in the wilderness with us. His sheep, his goats, they're all out there, and we haven't touched one of them. We've actually protected them. And so, in some way, he feels like he should receive something from him. But that doesn't make his attitude right as he goes through it. Very good. Someone else? Anyone else? There's something in verse 3 I saw. It says, the woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. How do others describe us? I think it's interesting how the writer here describes these two people. And of course, Abigail has a beautiful description of herself. Nabal, not so much. But the question I have is, if someone were to describe you, how would they describe you? How would they describe me? I think that's important when we talk about living our life. How can we be described by others? You get down to the end, starting in verse 28. Abigail, she recognizes what's going on. She acts quickly. She gathers all these things to take to David and his men. And she has 4 actions that I think are really important. I've got them up here. The first thing she does is she asks for forgiveness. She didn't cause this problem. It wasn't because of her, but yet she was willing to ask David to forgive her and her household. The next thing she did was she acknowledges God's choice. In a time when there is confusion, in a time when you have the king chasing David, when you have David basically being an outlaw, living out in the wilderness, things are not clear. It seems that Abigail somehow has knowledge about what has gone on, and about David has been appointed to eventually be king. And she acknowledges this. She acknowledges God's choice. I think the third thing, we've talked a little bit about it, and it's very important, is that Abigail keeps David from sinning. This version has a phrase that says, David tells his men to strap on their swords, and then he straps his on too. He wasn't going out to talk. He wasn't going out to negotiate. He only had one reason for going out. And he even says that if there's a man left in Nabal's house at the end of the day, he's like, I'm not who I say I am. But she stops him and keeps him from sinning. David is guilty enough already. We'll read further on in the story. It gets towards the end of David's life. David wants to build a temple for God. And God says, no, you can't, because you're a man of war. For this very reason we're seeing here. Someone who shed blood. The fourth thing that Abigail does here is that she is a peacemaker. Very familiar scripture we all know, Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, in the Sermon on the Mount. It says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. So when one action is present, why are we recognized as sons or children of God? Being a peacemaker, why does that make us sons of God, as Jesus describes here? I can tell them I have to ask a lot more questions, get people moving here. Yeah.
what about this for a second here? Like, how do you really want to respond?
Right. No, that's a good.
Your question, but it's just like where my brain is this morning.
No, that's a good question. You know, how can you be a peacemaker in certain situations like that, right? Abigail, of course, in this situation, found a way to do it. She had to act fast, and she had to to get there before she had to intercept David, basically, before he showed up. Go ahead.
When I think about a peacemaker, I think about like what is not.
Okay. All right. What is not?
Like, you know what I mean? Like someone who would escalate the situation or fuel the fire, or you know what I mean? Like
Yep.
those people are evidently not.
Hmm.
Like if she had went to her husband and said, "Oh, you're so right. Like let's do this. Let's lead him head on," that would obviously not be promoting peace.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So sometimes when I think about what a peacemaker is, I kind of think of like, okay, what would I do that would not actually be peaceful?
Okay. All right. And that's a great example because, unfortunately, we can look around us today and see actions of people that are not peacemakers. We see abundant examples of people who are not peacemakers. This is a good example of what Kate brought up as well. So, what will not make peace? And let's do the opposite, right? All right. Yeah, go ahead, Leslie. Okay. Mhm. Right. Yeah. That's very good, and thanks for bringing that up because I haven't hit on that yet. But yes, David was willing to listen, and he did listen, and it changed his course of action because of that. And that'll get us into, Lisa, next slide. Aha, lessons from David. So Craig had, when he was going to be gone, he gave me a couple of lessons. One of them I've already done last time for him. This one I hadn't done, so that's why I chose this one. And the questions that he put down, I really liked because they cause us to, I think they cause us to think about stuff we don't think about a lot. So the first question, and I've got them in a set of 3, but we're talking about advice. Abigail gave advice. She gave some direction to David, and he accepted it. He thought it was good advice, and it stopped him from doing certain things. So what is good, wise advice? How do you define that in your life? What is good and wise advice? Or how do we know what good advice is? How do we determine what good advice is? Because we hear a lot of people that tell us a lot of things. Now, Ron mentioned a family member. Yeah, I was going to say that, mother-in-law. And there are certain family members we have that may give advice regularly, right? Whether we ask for it or not, they are pretty open with giving advice to us. But how do we know what is good and what is wise advice and what we should act on? Go ahead, Chris.
So this always kind of makes me laugh because, like, when I think about advice, you know, there's a saying like you don't take advice from people that don't have what you want. So I would never take marriage advice from someone who's been divorced 4 or 5 times. Like,
Oh, okay.
not a bad person,
Right.
but they're not a marriage expert.
Okay.
Right? Like I wouldn't take parenting advice from someone who has no children. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's just kind of like to think about who's been there, who's been in the situation, who has the credibility, the qualifications to give you advice.
Okay. All right.
Like,
Yeah.
are you going to listen to, you know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
like a situation. Like,
Who has the life experience and who's been there? Right.
yes,
That's
right,
very good. Yeah.
They've got the facts, they've got the experience, they know. Well, anybody can say, I'm never going to give my kid a pacifier. Well, if you don't have 4 kids, you only have 0, you don't know what you're going to do, right? Like, that's just a really personal example. I think as mothers, we really get the most unsolicited advice ever. You know what I mean? We're like, hey, honey, your baby, is it your first one? It's like, no, I'm good. You know what I mean? I just think
Okay.
it's helpful, but like to me, when you were talking earlier about unsolicited advice, I'm like, motherhood. That's like, that's like the one, you know, and so it's just like when you're thinking about advice in general,
Right, right.
you know, like, who is giving you advice?
Who's giving you advice?
Credibility of their experience.
And you're right, it does make a difference. It also makes a difference the connection you have with them as far as relationship, right? When a stranger comes up in the store and gives you advice, I don't know about you, but I'm very skeptical. And I sometimes I don't even hear them because I'm thinking, why is this person even talking to me? What are they doing, you know? But it makes a difference, relationships, and it also makes a difference in people's life experience. Or someone else, how do we determine what is good or wise advice?
Most of the time when you get advice, it's, well, this is the way I would do it.
Okay.
I would tell you to do it this way. So if they've not met that person where they are, they made it about them. I'm going to show you how to do what I do. If it works for me, it may not work.
Right.
In the case of Abigail, she loaded his donkey and set him on down the road. She went and met David where he was.
Very good, yes.
I understand you did that.
Yeah.
Okay. And she met him where he was and didn't say, this is what you need to do, this is how you need to do it. Like we had told before.
Right.
Met him there, admitted humbly, you mean her husband needs to know.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that is an excellent point. Meeting people where they are. And you're right as far as when you hear advice from others, you do hear that phrase, if it were me, I would do this. But they may not totally understand. They haven't gone over there and seen what you've seen, and they haven't experienced what you... Right. And that's good, very good. And Abigail did do that. She made that effort and went down there and met him and was humble on that. Very good. Someone else. You don't listen too hard, do you?
Not in a bad way, but it's like, I keep that circle of people that I'm willing to like take advice from extremely tight.
Okay,
It's
all right.
almost intuitive, right?
All right.
And outside of that, like outside of that core like group of people I know, when you ask like what's good advice, like I'm 1,000% confident that this core group of people is going to be advice that you can count on, right? Like advice
Right.
that is correct, I guess you could say. But for me, that's
Well, it goes back to relationships, doesn't it? Relationships and what we've experienced from them. So I've got several friends, and they give advice regularly, and almost 100% of the time, I listen to their advice all the time. But I very, very, very rarely act on it because I know what they're giving me is. I was like, that's just not. It's not going to work. But they continue. Go ahead, Leslie. Yeah. Okay. Right. 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 And yeah. And I appreciate you bringing that up because didn't have that written down, but you're exactly right. Yeah. There is a necessity for us to be willing to listen at least to others. Whether we take their advice or not, it's another thing, but listening to them and seeing different points of view that we may not, because we all run into that as well where we get stuck in a closed room with our own thoughts, and we just can't see our way out sometimes. And we definitely need to hear what other people say because we learn from each other. That's one of the reasons I love Sunday morning class. When people answer questions, we get to see things from a different perspective that we haven't seen before. And I think that's very important for us. All right, anyone else before we move on? So there's several scriptures we're going to look at today, and the rest of them are shorter ones. Proverbs chapter 13, verse 20. Whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. The writer of Proverbs has a lot of general truths for us. This is generally true. You probably found it true in your own life as well. We've all had friends that we've spent time with that make bad decisions, and when we spend time with them and making those bad decisions, we end up with the same consequences they have. It talks about walking with the wise. What we're talking about here is, and it'll be pointed out here in a minute as well, who do we spend our time with? Who do we listen to? It's important who we listen to. It's important who we listen to. You went too fast. Go back one, if you can. Okay. How hard is it to listen to and heed wise advice or wise counsel? Is it hard? May mean a change. Okay, so right. So in some ways it is hard, isn't it, Ron?
Yep.
Yeah.
The difficult part is us as human beings getting our time flat mode when we see advice is good.
Mm-hmm.
And you're judging me as an individual wall of
Okay.
accepting, taking what you can out of the conversation. They're wrong. Accept that person.
Right, right.
You might try to avoid people
I had a certain person when we lived outside the country. This person would come to me every time I spoke Hungarian, and he would tell me straight out. He's like, "You should never speak Hungarian again." And he would just tell me this over and over. But it was every time, and it was exactly that same thing. I would see him coming after I got done speaking. I went the other direction. And that would be what I would spend the rest of the time doing, is avoiding this person, because I knew what he was going to say. He didn't need to say it again. But that's what it becomes, doesn't it? It becomes avoidance a lot of times. Chris, you had something? Witness protection.
Well, I was gonna say sometimes it is easy to take advice.
Okay.
Like Kate was talking about, if we trust someone,
If we trust someone, yeah.
we know that they have our good intentions, like good intentions
Mm-hmm.
with us. And then sometimes, like, when we come up with a decision, especially if it's like this way or this way, we kind of know in our hearts what's morally good and is right. We just are kind of afraid to make that decision. So that's why we seek advice.
Okay.
I kind of wonder, it doesn't say, but like as quickly as David changed his mind, it makes you wonder if he didn't already know in his heart what was morally good.
Okay.
And then seeing that advice from, the way that she behaved, the way that she greeted him, the way that she's already known as a beautiful and
Right.
nice person, so maybe her advice was attractive already
Mm-hmm.
because of
Yeah.
who she was, but also because of his inside, he kind of knew what was wrong.
Right, right, right.
I don't know.
And you're right. A lot of times we already know at least which way we're leaning or what we'd like to do. And sometimes we ask for advice. We were looking for confirmation or looking for something else. I don't know how many times I've gone. I had this situation we were dealing with when we were in Hungary, and I came back to the U.S. and I sought advice from these wise elders. They were older. They had been on the mission field. They had done all sorts of things. And I asked him I put the scenario to him, and his answer was, it wasn't the answer I wanted at all. He smiles at me and said, you know that culture better than anyone here. I know that you're going to make the right decision. And then he walked away. I was like, well, what kind of, I was seriously mad. I was like, what kind of, I was mad for a week. I was like, what kind of advice is that? That didn't help me out any. But it was what I needed to hear so that I could look at what I had been doing and look at how I had been responding to people. They may have been, I don't know. I would have thought that, except he was one of the only people during our years gone. I just got a phone call in the middle of the night, and he called and said, just wanted to tell you that we love you and we trust everything that you're doing, just out of the blue. And he's one of these sort of men that I couldn't ignore what he said. He was really good at what he did. So the question is so it makes a difference who we spend time with, who we listen to, even as adults. We say this all the time to our children, but it makes a difference for us as well. Do we listen to the wrong people? Now, each of us have so many things we hear during the day, whether it's TV, whether it's radio, whether it's other people at work. There's people that I'm around all the time. I hear all these things. The question is who am I listening to? Am I listening to these people, or am I listening to God and the things that He wants from us? Last week, we were treated to hearing Eric Wilson. And I enjoyed his message so much, I went online and started looking for some of the other stuff that because he's got a lot of, if you want to know, he's got a lot of podcasts he did during COVID. And they're just equally good as what he did last week. It was really good. And there was one I was listening to this week, and it was interesting that he was talking about this exact same subject. And he connected this to wisdom. When we start listening to other people's advice, and the exact phrase he says, it says that we need a listening heart. Because wisdom, what wisdom looks like is when we're in possession of a listening heart. One that's willing to listen to God, and one that's willing to listen to those around us. He's got a lot of scriptures that connected with it. I don't know if I wrote those down or not, Lisa, did I? I did. There we go. 1 Kings chapter 3. I should pay attention to what I actually write on these, I guess. 1 Kings chapter 3. His whole lesson was based upon this. So God comes to Solomon and says, I'll give you anything in the world that you want. What do you want? What does he say? Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this, your great people? This version says an understanding mind. Solomon wanted a heart. He wanted a heart that would listen to God. Listen to God. Listening is key to our relationship with God. If we're going to keep God's commands, first we've got to hear what God tells us. Next one, Deuteronomy chapter 6. Very foundational scripture in the Old Testament. It says, Hear, O Israel. Did you hear it? Hear, O Israel, listening heart. The Lord your God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Romans chapter 10 talks about, so faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. A heart willing to listen is necessary for faith. We need to have a listening heart. So we've been talking about how do we know something's right? How do we know something's in keeping with the Father's will? And Eric used this one phrase that really, I had to stop the podcast. It was really good. He says, does it sound like our shepherd's voice? There's so many things that are wrapped up in that phrase. Does it sound like our shepherd's voice? First of all, you've got to know what your shepherd's voice sounds like, doesn't it? Don't you? If you're a parent, I don't know how many times this happened to me. I'd be on a playground, and some kid would yell, Daddy. And every man that's standing there, their head swivel and they look fast. Because they're listening for that voice. If we could do that with our Savior more and more every day, that when He spoke, we would just stop and listen to what was being said. Whether it's coming from His written word, from a brother or sister, from someone who is just out of the blue talking with us. If we could have that listening heart to hear our shepherd's voice. Go ahead, Lisa. John chapter 10, verse 27, it says, My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. So at home, we've got a couple of dogs. And dogs are very smart. They figure out who is taking care of them that day, and they act appropriately. So for some reason, when my kids take the dogs out, they do whatever they want. They'll pull the kids down, they'll go this way, they won't cooperate, they won't do anything else. But if I go out there, they act totally different. In fact, if one of the dogs gets loose and I yell, most of the time, not all the time, most of the time, they'll stop and come back. But my kids can scream and yell all day long, and they won't think a single thing about it. Here we're talking about the sheep. The shepherd, he speaks up. The sheep know who he is, and they follow. They follow. So last thing, we'll just finish up with this. Go ahead, Lisa, the next one. So what keeps us from taking good advice? Next one, too? I'll give you a hint. All right, here we go. Craig wrote these down. I think a lot of these are really good. We don't know it's sound advice. It's good advice. How many times have we said in our lives, I should have listened to that person, or I should have done this? We've heard something, we just didn't know it was good advice. The second one is I just don't want to use it. Sometimes because of who it's coming from. You know, I've had people in my life, they tell me advice, and they've hurt me. I've struggled with them in the past, and it doesn't matter what comes out of their mouth, I am not going to do it. It doesn't matter if it's the best advice I will ever get for the rest of my life. I'm just not going to do it because of who it's coming from. But sometimes we just don't want to use the advice we get. The third one, I'm too proud. Our stubbornness and our pride are getting in our way too often. I wonder if God doesn't respond to our requests many times in ways that he knows are not likable or appealing to us, to see if we're really focused on him, to see if we're really listening. I think he may sometimes. To see if our hearts can be formed in the way he needs them to be formed. Last two, I didn't think of it. Because I didn't think of it, it can't be good, right? How many times does that come across your mind? Or it just won't work. So I work in an engineering profession, and there's a lot of crazy ideas that are thrown out during the course of a single day. And there are certain people in my office that are known for crazy ideas. You ask them an engineering question, and boy, you know you're going to get the most off-the-wall, crazy sort of idea it could ever come up with. And you immediately say, it's just not going to work. But I think we do that with advice as well. We immediately say it's not going to work when we should stop and at least hear them out and think about it. All right, last one, go ahead. There's a few scriptures. I'll just leave these up here as we leave. But the first one is the only one I'm going to read, James chapter 4, verse 10. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. If we're going to have a listening heart, we're going to have to be humble. We're going to be humble with God, with others, and let's this week have a listening heart. So thank you all for your thoughts and your comments today. And I believe Craig is back next week. We will see. If he's not, I'll be here. Bad advice.